The evening shift had been monotonously uneventful, the kind that made Officer Sarah Martinez question why she'd chosen this career path. For 8 hours, she'd cruised the quiet streets of Riverside, watching nothing happen. No accidents, no crimes, no incidents worth documenting in her log. Just the monotonous routine of patrol, turning corners, scanning empty parking lots, stopping at red lights that turned green to nothing. By 11:47 p.m., Sarah was counting down the minutes until she could hand her patrol car over to the night shift officer and drive home to her tiny apartment, where her cat, Bella, would be waiting with demanding meows for her dinner. The night was unseasonably warm for October, carrying that strange, unsettled feeling that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Sarah had rolled down her windows about an hour ago, letting the crisp breeze flow through the patrol car. The radio crackled occasionally with calls from other districts, a shoplifter in downtown, a noise complaint on Elm Street, the usual urban background noise. Her district, Riverside, remained quiet, almost eerily quiet. As Sarah approached Riverside Park, a sprawling green space with oak trees and walking paths, she noticed the streetlights casting their amber glow across the empty parking lot. The park closed at sunset, and it was now approaching midnight. Technically, she should have been patrolling the commercial district on the other side of town, but she diverted here on instinct, a habit developed over 7 years on the force. Sometimes criminals used abandoned parks at night. She'd prevented 3 muggings and 1 attempted car theft by following these random hunches. Tonight, though, seemed like just another dead end. Sarah slowed her patrol car as she approached the far end of the parking lot, where streetlights cast fragmented shadows between parked vehicles. Most of the cars belonged to night shift workers from the nearby hospital and office complex. She was about to turn and head toward the next neighborhood when movement caught her eye, something small, something desperate, emerging from beneath a silver Civic near the park's entrance. Sarah immediately killed her lights and pulled over, her training kicking in automatically. She watched carefully, alert for any criminal activity. What she saw, however, wasn't a threat. It was a living creature, a puppy. The small German shepherd stumbled into the parking lot's dim light, his movements uncoordinated and panicked. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the animal was in distress. The puppy's fur was matted with dirt and something darker that might have been mud or worse. His tiny body trembled visibly, and his movements suggested hunger and exhaustion. Sarah guessed the puppy was no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, barely weaned, still that awkward stage where puppies hadn't grown into their proportions. Sarah's heart immediately softened. She'd grown up with dogs and had a particular fondness for German shepherds, having trained alongside police K-9 units during a community outreach program. She opened her patrol car door quietly, speaking in low, calm tones. "Hey, buddy, easy there. I'm not going to hurt you." The puppy's head snapped toward her voice. For a moment, Sarah expected the typical response. A frightened animal would bolt into the darkness or try to hide. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The puppy's entire body language changed. Instead of running away from the uniformed officer, it immediately began moving toward her, as if recognizing her as a potential savior. Sarah's training told her to proceed cautiously. A frightened animal could bite, even unintentionally. But something in the puppy's desperate scramble toward her, the way its tiny legs pumped with urgency, the way its tail wasn't wagging but thrashing in what seemed like panic, suggested this animal wasn't afraid of her. It was afraid of something else. "Come here, sweetheart," Sarah called gently, crouching to make herself less intimidating. She extended her hand, showing the puppy her palm. "What happened to you, buddy?" The puppy covered the distance between them with surprising speed for such a small animal. It pressed its entire body against Sarah's legs, and she felt it trembling violently. Up close, the condition was worse than she'd initially assessed. Not only was the puppy filthy, but he was also dangerously thin. His ribs were visible through his matted fur. His eyes, though bright and alert, held a desperation that made Sarah's chest ache. "Oh, sweetie," she whispered, gently stroking the puppy's head. That's when the truly unusual behavior began. The puppy grabbed Sarah's sleeve with its tiny teeth, not aggressively but insistently. It tugged at her sleeve, then ran a few feet away before stopping and looking back at her with those desperate eyes. The message was unmistakable: follow me. Please, follow me. Sarah's police instincts, honed by 7 years of fieldwork and countless training scenarios, suddenly activated in a new way. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a lost puppy wandering through a parking lot. The animal's behavior was too deliberate, too purposeful. Animals didn't typically seek out police officers specifically unless something was profoundly wrong. Sarah glanced around the empty parking lot, then down at the small puppy staring up at her with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young creature. She'd handled hundreds of calls, conducted thousands of patrols, but something about this moment felt different, significant, like standing at a crossroads where her next decision would matter. She radioed dispatch, keeping her voice professional despite the unusual situation. Unit 47 to dispatch. I'm investigating a possible animal welfare issue at Riverside Park, East Lot. Might take a few minutes. Dispatch's voice crackled back. Copy Unit 47, be safe out there. Sarah clipped her radio back to her belt and looked at the puppy, who was now doing a little dance of urgency, moving a few feet away and looking back constantly. Okay, buddy, lead the way. Let's see what you're trying to tell me. The puppy bolted forward, and Sarah followed, her hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on her belt. They left the safety of the parking lot's amber streetlights and entered the darker territory beyond, a maze of residential backyards and shadowed alleyways that marked the boundary between the park and the surrounding neighborhood. The small German Shepherd moved with surprising determination, weaving through gaps in fences and navigating terrain that seemed impossibly difficult for an 8-week-old puppy. Sarah had to jog to keep up, her police training making her acutely aware of her surroundings, her hand never far from her equipment belt. As they moved deeper into the darkened landscape, leaving behind the familiar streets and commercial areas, Sarah realized she was venturing into territory she didn't regularly patrol. The buildings here were older, more industrial. The neighborhood changed character, fewer homes, more warehouses and commercial structures. The well-maintained yards and garden lights of Riverside gave way to a grittier, more neglected landscape. The puppy's urgency never wavered. If anything, it increased. The small dog was leading her somewhere specific. Sarah was absolutely certain now. And whatever awaited her at the end of this journey, it was significant enough that a traumatized, malnourished puppy had chosen to risk everything to find help. Sarah's heart raced with anticipation and concern as the buildings grew larger, older, and increasingly abandoned around them. Whatever this little creature was trying to show her, her life was about to change forever. The October night air grew colder as Officer Sarah Martinez ventured deeper into unfamiliar territory, following the determined little German Shepherd puppy that had sought her out in the parking lot. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating overgrown hedges and weathered fences. The sounds of the city, distant traffic, occasional sirens from other districts, the hum of nightlife from downtown, seemed to fade with each step forward, replaced by an unsettling silence that made Sarah acutely aware of how isolated she'd become. Behind her, the glow of Riverside Park streetlights had completely disappeared. Ahead, nothing but shadow and the small, desperate puppy's silhouette against her flashlight beam. Sarah's training kept her cautious. She'd learned never to let situations control her. She controlled situations. But tonight, she was relinquishing control to an animal barely weighing more than 10 pounds, trusting its judgment over her own experience. The puppy paused occasionally, checking to ensure Sarah was still following. Those moments crystallized something in Sarah's mind. This was no accident. The animal wasn't lost and wandering aimlessly. It was on a mission, with purpose and determination that belied its age and physical condition. "I'm right here, buddy," Sarah called softly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Show me where we're going." They navigated through a residential neighborhood that seemed frozen in decline. The houses here were older, most with broken fences and unkempt yards. Porch lights were dark, curtains were drawn. Sarah passed a house with a missing window, another with boards nailed across the front door. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where residents felt safe enough to leave lights on at night. She'd worked enough domestic disturbance calls to recognize the signs of socioeconomic struggle, poverty, desperation, and sometimes danger. The puppy suddenly changed direction, veering left between two particularly dilapidated houses. Sarah followed, ducking under a low-hanging tree branch that scraped against her uniform. Her tactical belt clinked softly as she moved. Her radio, her flashlight, her weapon, her keys. Each piece of equipment reminding her that she was still Officer Martinez, still trained, still prepared for whatever came next. The alleyway behind the houses was narrow and treacherous. Abandoned debris littered the ground. Old tires, broken wooden pallets, rusted metal containers. Sarah had to watch her footing carefully, not wanting to trip and lose sight of the puppy. Her mind raced with questions. Where was this animal's home? How far had it traveled in this condition? How long had it been lost? After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the character of their surroundings shifted dramatically. The residential neighborhood gave way to industrial territory. The houses vanished, replaced by larger structures, warehouses, manufacturing plants, and storage facilities. This was the kind of area Sarah knew primarily from crime reports and criminal incident statistics. Robberies, vandalism, and drug activity were common in neighborhoods like this. The police department actually had a special unit dedicated to patrolling industrial zones after midnight. The puppy's pace accelerated as they approached this threshold, as if the animal's home, or the destination it was trying to reach, was close. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the radio clipped to her shoulder. She should call for backup. She absolutely should call for backup. Every protocol she'd learned in the academy screamed at her to do so. She was a solo officer, alone in unfamiliar territory at midnight, following an animal to an unknown location in a high-crime zone. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the puppy's obvious desperation. Maybe it was 7 years of police experience telling her that this situation, while unusual, didn't feel immediately dangerous. Maybe it was simply empathy, the knowledge that whatever crisis this animal was responding to needed immediate attention, and backup might delay critical minutes. Sarah keyed her radio with deliberate calmness. "Unit 47 to dispatch. I'm investigating an animal welfare issue. Currently on foot, pursuing subject from Riverside Park area, heading into the industrial district, approximately 4 blocks north of my initial location. Might take a few minutes." "Copy, Unit 47, dispatch responded. "Call for backup if needed. Stay safe." "Will do," Sarah confirmed, then lowered her radio volume to minimize distractions. The puppy approached a massive structure ahead, a warehouse that dominated the landscape like a sleeping giant. The building was 3 stories tall, constructed of faded red brick and corrugated metal panels. Its windows, where they existed, were either broken or covered with plywood. The front entrance was secured with a chain and heavy padlock, but the chain was old, showing signs of rust. The entire structure screamed abandonment and disuse. Sarah's mind registered the details automatically, the officer in her nodding everything, the lack of security cameras, the overgrown lot surrounding the building, the absence of any company signage or identifying information. This building had been vacant for some time. It was exactly the kind of structure that attracted criminal activity, drug manufacturing, unauthorized salvage operations, or worse. The puppy approached the building's side, where an exposed metal door hung slightly ajar, its lock mechanism clearly broken. The small dog squeezed through the gap, pausing on the other side to look back at Sarah with urgent, desperate eyes. Sarah's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed caution. This was exactly how situations went wrong, officers getting drawn into dangerous locations without backup, making decisions based on emotion rather than protocol. She'd attended too many police academy memorial services to take unnecessary risks. But then she looked at the puppy's face, really looked at it, and she saw something beyond desperation. She saw maternal concern. She saw the kind of urgency that transcended the animal's physical weakness. Whatever was on the other side of that door, the puppy considered it more important than its own survival. Sarah made her decision. She drew her service weapon from its holster, a precautionary measure, not an act of aggression, and held it at the ready position, barrel pointed downward. She activated the bright tactical flashlight on her belt, illuminating the gap in the door. Her eyes swept across the opening, searching for threats. She saw only darkness beyond and heard only the small puppy's whimper from inside the building. Taking a breath to center herself, Sarah approached the door. She placed her hand on the cold metal and it creaked inward, expanding the gap. The smell that hit her was overpowering, a nauseating combination of animal waste, decay, and something else she couldn't immediately identify. Her stomach lurched. "Okay," she whispered to herself, a mantra of courage. "Okay, you can do this." Sarah squeezed through the gap, her weapon still held ready, her flashlight beam sweeping across the dark interior of the warehouse. The puppy circled around her legs, still urgent, still desperate, pulling at her pant leg with its tiny teeth. "Show me," Sarah said softly. "Show me what I need to see." The puppy bolted deeper into the darkness, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had no backup, no communication advantage, no certainty about what awaited her in this abandoned building. She had only instinct, training, and faith in a traumatized puppy that had chosen to trust her. That faith was about to be tested in ways Officer Sarah Martinez could never have imagined. The warehouse's interior was a labyrinth of shadows and decay. Officer Sarah Martinez's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness in fragments, illuminating scattered debris, overturned boxes, and structural elements that had deteriorated over years of neglect. The smell intensified as she moved deeper, that sickening combination of ammonia, waste, and something organic that made her gag. She'd smelled similar odors before during welfare checks on hoarded homes, but this was different, more concentrated, more systematically wrong. The small puppy moved with unwavering determination, navigating around obstacles as if following a well-worn path. Sarah realized with mounting horror that the puppy knew this place intimately. This wasn't a random location. This was where the animal had been living. The thought made her chest tighten. They approached a series of makeshift structures in the warehouse's corner, hastily constructed enclosures fashioned from plywood and wire fencing. Sarah's flashlight beam caught details that made her blood run cold. Food bowls, water containers, and bedding, or what had once been bedding. The enclosures were cramped, clearly designed to hold animals in minimal space. Her police training immediately categorized what she was seeing, evidence of illegal animal confinement. The puppy began whimpering, a sound of desperation and something else, recognition perhaps, relief that help had finally arrived. The small dog pressed against Sarah's leg, and she realized she was witnessing raw emotion in animal form. The puppy had carried itself on injured paws through a dangerous neighborhood, sought out a police officer specifically, and led her to this place because something inside it understood that this situation required intervention beyond its capacity. "I'm here, buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Show me what you need me to see." The puppy led her to one of the larger enclosures, and Sarah aimed her flashlight inside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, in a space no larger than a standard bathroom, was an adult German shepherd, clearly the puppy's mother. The dog was lying down, her body pressed against the back corner of the enclosure as if trying to disappear into the walls. But what struck Sarah most profoundly was the animal's condition. The mother dog's ribs protruded sharply through matted, filthy fur. Her bones seemed skeletal, as if the animal had been systematically starved. Fresh wounds covered her back and sides, wounds that appeared deliberate, inflicted injuries rather than accidental scratches. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her weapon automatically lowering as professional concerns yielded to humanitarian horror. "Oh my God, what have they done to you?" The mother dog's head lifted slightly at the sound of Sarah's voice. Her eyes, though dulled by suffering and malnutrition, carried a flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps resignation. The animal didn't move toward the cage door. She simply stared, watching this uniformed stranger with the wariness of a creature that had learned not to expect kindness from humans. But the smaller puppy beside Sarah immediately began crying, a high-pitched whimper that echoed through the warehouse. The sound seemed to trigger something in the mother dog. She attempted to stand, her movements stiff and painful, and limped toward the cage door where her offspring waited on the other side of the wire barrier. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the enclosure again, and she noticed movement in the shadows behind the mother dog. Two additional puppies, even smaller and more emaciated than the one she'd followed, were huddled together on a pile of filthy, feces-stained blankets. These puppies didn't even raise their heads at her presence. They were too weak, too traumatized, too broken. Sarah's law enforcement training warred with her human empathy. Every instinct told her this was an active crime scene requiring immediate documentation and preservation. But her heart screamed that these animals needed medical attention immediately. Seconds and minutes mattered when dealing with animals in this condition. She made a rapid assessment of the other enclosures nearby. 4 separate structures, each containing various levels of animal suffering. In one enclosure, she spotted an older German shepherd with scarring along her muzzle, signs of repeated breeding without recovery periods. The dog appeared to be in even worse condition than the mother dog, barely conscious on the warehouse floor. Sarah's mind was already formulating her response strategy, even as tears of rage and sorrow began streaming down her face. She'd worked animal welfare calls before, abandoned dogs, neglectful owners, cases of general mistreatment, but nothing had prepared her for this systematic, deliberate operation. This wasn't the result of ignorance or financial hardship. This was calculated cruelty, designed specifically to extract profit from animal suffering. The small puppy continued to cry, pressing against the wire of its mother's enclosure. The mother dog responded with desperate whimpers, pressing her skeletal face against the barrier. The reunion, separated by mere inches of wire, was heartbreaking. This was a mother recognizing her offspring after what had probably been days of separation. The puppy must have escaped from the warehouse, managed to survive alone in the streets, and then deliberately sought help. Sarah holstered her weapon carefully and keyed her radio, her voice controlled despite the fury and heartbreak coursing through her. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need to report a potential animal abuse situation. It's significant. I'm at an abandoned warehouse approximately 4 blocks north of Riverside Park, Industrial District. I need animal control and a supervisor here immediately. This is a serious situation." "Copy, Unit 47, dispatch responded, the operator's professional tone shifting as she registered Sarah's unusual stress level. "Sending backup and animal control to your location. What's your address?" Sarah looked around, trying to locate any identifying information on the building. The warehouse on the corner of Industrial Way and 5th Avenue, the old manufacturing facility, multiple animals in distress, signs of systematic abuse. This appears to be an illegal operation. "Understood," units responding, ETA 8 minutes. Sarah lowered her radio and turned her complete attention back to the enclosures. Her police training kicked in fully now. She needed to document everything, preserve evidence, and ensure nothing was disturbed before the investigation team arrived. She began photographing the scene methodically, capturing images of each enclosure, the animals' conditions, the food and water bowls, everything that might serve as evidence. As she worked, The small puppy that had led her here climbed into her lap, seemingly exhausted from the night's emotional and physical exertion. Sarah held the tiny creature against her chest, feeling its racing heartbeat, its trembling body still malnourished and traumatized. She stroked the puppy's filthy fur gently, whispering reassurances. "You did good, buddy," she said softly. "You were so brave, you saved them, you saved your family." The mother dog watched this interaction through the wire barrier, and something seemed to shift in her eyes. Perhaps she understood that her offspring had succeeded where she'd failed, that her baby had somehow summoned help that would liberate them from this nightmare. Sarah continued documenting the scene, her camera capturing the systematic nature of the operation. Detailed breeding records lay on a makeshift desk in the corner, spreadsheets tracking each dog, their breeding dates, veterinary neglect, and profit margins. The records indicated this operation had been running for over 2 years, producing hundreds of puppies sold to unscrupulous pet shops and online dealers across multiple states. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't small-scale animal abuse. This was organized animal trafficking, a criminal enterprise that had systematically produced suffering on an industrial scale. And it had all been exposed because one desperate, courageous puppy had refused to abandon its family and had somehow understood that a uniformed police officer represented hope. In the distance, Sarah heard sirens approaching. Red and blue lights began flickering against the warehouse walls as police units and animal control vehicles pulled into the abandoned facility's lot. Help was finally arriving. Sarah looked down at the exhausted puppy in her arms, then at the mother dog pressing against the cage door, then at the 2 suffering siblings inside the enclosure. She thought about the older dog in the adjacent cage and all the other animals that had suffered within these walls. "It's over," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the animals or to herself. "It's finally over. Help is here." Arrival of animal control marked the beginning of what would become an intricate, emotionally charged rescue operation. Officer Sarah Martinez stood aside as trained professionals moved into the warehouse with equipment designed specifically for extracting suffering animals. The red and blue emergency lights cast an almost theatrical glow across the scene, transforming the warehouse's interior into something resembling a disaster zone, which, in many ways, it was. James Richardson, the senior animal control officer, was a weathered veteran of 23 years. He'd seen countless cases of animal neglect, but even he seemed visibly shaken as he surveyed the enclosures. His team of 3 moved methodically, their training evident in every deliberate action. They weren't rushing. They understood that sudden movements or aggressive handling could further traumatize already fragile animals. "We're going to need additional resources," James said to Sarah, pulling out his phone. "This isn't a simple rescue. This is a systematic operation. These animals are severely malnourished, and some show signs of injury that suggest they've been abused for extended periods." He began documenting the scene with his own camera, creating a parallel record to Sarah's official police documentation. Sarah watched as the team approached the mother dog, the animal that had given birth to the brave puppy now resting in Sarah's arms. The puppy, whom the animal control team had temporarily nicknamed Scout, because of his apparent mission to scout for help, trembled slightly at the sight of strangers approaching his mother. But he remained calm, as if understanding that these people were different from his previous handlers. "Easy girl," James called softly to the mother dog, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "We're here to help you. We're going to get you somewhere safe." The mother dog didn't resist as James carefully opened the enclosure. Her ribs jutted out so severely that Sarah could count each individual bone from where she stood. The dog's fur was matted with feces and urine, and her eyes held that particular kind of resignation that came from prolonged suffering, the acceptance of pain as a permanent condition. James gently secured a soft collar around the mother dog's neck, then lifted her with surprising tenderness. Despite his size and the dog's desperate condition, he handled her as if she were made of the most delicate glass. The mother dog didn't struggle. She simply allowed herself to be lifted, her body limp and trusting in a way that suggested she'd learned long ago that resistance was futile. "We'll call her Hope," James said quietly, perhaps realizing that a name might help humanize the animal beyond its current status as victim and evidence. "She's going to need immediate veterinary attention." The other two puppies in Hope's enclosure were even more challenging. They were so weak they could barely stand. One of the team members, a younger woman named Maria, carefully lifted each puppy, wrapping them in emergency blankets designed to preserve warmth and prevent shock. The puppies didn't cry or struggle. They simply hung limply, their eyes barely focusing. "How many dogs total?" Sarah asked, mentally cataloging what she'd seen. "5 in these main enclosures," James replied, moving to assess the older German Shepherd in the adjacent cage. "But look at the records on that desk. They've been producing litters regularly. This operation has likely resulted in hundreds of animals passing through these enclosures over the past 2 years." Sarah's jaw tightened. Hundreds of puppies raised in these conditions, then sold to unsuspecting buyers or to pet shops that didn't care about their origins. The scope of the criminal enterprise was expanding in her mind. This wasn't just about the 5 animals currently in the warehouse. This was about systematic animal trafficking on a significant scale. A second animal control vehicle arrived, and an emergency veterinary technician named Doctor stepped out with medical equipment. Doctor was the emergency veterinarian for the city's animal control division, a woman with a reputation for performing miracles with animals that everyone else had written off as beyond saving. "Show me what we have," Doctor commanded, her professional demeanor indicating she'd seen similar situations before, though her eyes betrayed genuine distress at the conditions. Over the next 30 minutes, Doctor conducted rapid preliminary assessments of each animal. She took temperature readings, checked for signs of infection, examined wounds, and made notes about each animal's apparent condition. Her expression grew progressively grimmer. "This one has a fractured rib," she said, examining Hope with careful hands. "Possibly 2. This one appears to have an untreated infection. See the inflammation here. And this wound hasn't been cleaned in weeks. We're looking at systemic malnutrition, parasitic infestation, and signs of physical abuse. These animals need immediate hospitalization and aggressive treatment protocols." Sarah felt Scout shift in her arms, the small puppy apparently sensing the urgency in Doctor's voice. The puppy whimpered softly, a sound of distress and perhaps recognition of a familiar fear, that something was desperately wrong with his mother. "Will they survive?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. Doctor looked at her directly, her eyes carrying both compassion and professional honesty. "The puppies have a good chance. They're young, which gives them resilience. The mother dog, she's in critical condition. If we get her into care immediately and she responds to treatment, possibly. But we're talking about weeks of recovery, intensive medical care, and psychological rehabilitation. These animals have been through significant trauma." The older German Shepherd in the adjacent enclosure required the most delicate handling. The dog was barely conscious, her body showing signs of repeated, systematic breeding without recovery periods. Doctor's assessment was more guarded for this animal. "This one's been through hell," Doctor said quietly. "I've seen backyard breeding operations, but this is industrial-scale animal abuse. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They were maximizing profit without any regard for the animal's welfare." By 2:47 a.m., all 5 dogs had been carefully transported into the 2 animal control vehicles. Sarah had made a decision that surprised even her. She requested permission to ride with Scout and Hope to the emergency veterinary clinic. Her supervisor, Captain Williams, who'd arrived at the scene to oversee the investigation, had initially objected. But after learning about Scout's role in leading Sarah to the warehouse, he'd made an exception. "You've got 2 hours with the animals," Captain Williams had said. "Then you need to come back and help with the investigation and documentation. We've got a major case here, Sarah." 2 hours is all I need," Sarah had replied. Now, sitting in the back of the animal control vehicle as it raced toward Riverside Emergency Veterinary Hospital, Sarah held Scout while watching Hope's shallow breathing. The mother dog had been sedated for transport to prevent injury from her panicked movements, but even sedated, she seemed to sense her offspring's presence. Scout was awake and alert now, watching his mother with an intensity that suggested understanding beyond what a typical 8-week-old puppy should possess. His tiny body pressed against Sarah's chest, and she could feel his racing heartbeat synchronizing with the vehicle's movement and the emergency sirens wailing through the night. The emergency veterinary clinic was state-of-the-art, designed specifically for urgent animal care. As they arrived, a team of veterinarians and technicians rushed out to help transfer the dogs to treatment areas. Doctor had radioed ahead with preliminary information, so the clinic was prepared for their arrival. Sarah was escorted to a waiting area, Scout still in her arms. She was told it would be several hours before the veterinarians had completed initial assessments and begun treatment protocols. She was encouraged to go home, get rest, and return in the morning. But Sarah couldn't leave. She found herself in one of the clinic's quiet rooms, cradling Scout against her chest, watching as the staff worked behind glass partitions to stabilize the mother dog and her siblings. An emergency technician brought her a blanket and a bottle of water. Another offered her coffee at 4 a.m. Scout fell asleep in her arms around that time, his body finally relaxing as the reality of safety began to replace the desperation of survival. Sarah sat in the silence of the veterinary clinic's waiting room, holding this brave puppy, thinking about the journey they'd taken together in just a few hours. From a parking lot to a warehouse, from desperation to rescue, from systematic abuse to the possibility, however fragile, of recovery and redemption. Sarah stroked Scout's ear gently, whispering promises into the darkness. "You're safe now, buddy," she whispered. "We're all going to be okay. I promise you that." Investigation began within hours of the warehouse discovery. By dawn on that fateful morning, Detective James, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades of experience in financial crimes, had been assigned to lead the case. What started as a simple animal cruelty investigation quickly transformed into something far more complex and sinister. A systematic criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and involved organized animal trafficking. Sarah spent the early morning hours providing her detailed statement to detective in the police station's conference room. She described everything meticulously: the puppy's appearance, its deliberate seeking of help, the warehouse location, the enclosures, the breeding records she'd discovered. Listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his experienced eyes recognizing immediately that this case extended far beyond a single isolated incident. "This looks organized," said, reviewing Sarah's photographs. "These records aren't casual notes. Someone's been systematically tracking breeding cycles, monitoring profit, and managing distribution. This is a business operation, a criminal one but organized." Within 12 hours, a task force had been assembled. It included detective, several uniformed officers, representatives from the state animal welfare department, and federal investigators from the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The discovery of breeding records documenting sales across 5 states had elevated the case from a local matter to a federal investigation. The financial records became the investigation's breakthrough point. Obtained warrants to access the warehouse's electrical records, which led to the identification of the facility's registered owner, a business entity called Riverside Commercial Properties, LLC. Tracing the LLC's formation documents, investigators discovered it was registered to a 53-year-old businessman who operated a supposedly legitimate construction and property development company. On the surface, appeared successful and respectable. He'd lived in the city for 15 years, owned multiple properties, belonged to the Chamber of Commerce, and had even made charitable donations to the city's parks department. But digging deeper, detective discovered a pattern of suspicious property acquisitions, always abandoned warehouses, always in industrial zones, always purchased through shell companies. "This guy's been doing this for years," explained to Sarah during one of the case debriefings. "We're seeing patterns going back at least 8 years. He probably started smaller, maybe 1 or 2 breeding operations, and expanded as profits increased." The investigation team executed search warrants on all of registered properties. What they discovered was staggering. Across the city and in 3 neighboring counties, they found 5 additional illegal breeding operations in various states of operation. In total, investigators rescued 247 dogs, some in conditions similar to Hope and her offspring, others in even worse states. The breeding records from all 6 locations painted a disturbing picture. The operation had been systematically producing puppies for 8 years, with detailed documentation of every breeding cycle, every litter, and every sale. The records indicated over 2,000 puppies had been produced and sold through his network. Some were sold to unscrupulous pet shops that didn't ask questions about origins. Others were sold through online platforms to buyers who believed they were purchasing from legitimate breeders. The financial impact was astonishing. This operation had generated over $3.2 million in revenue over the 8-year period, with minimal expenses since he systematically starved and neglected the animals to maximize profit margins. Sarah was assigned as the case's primary police liaison, which meant she worked closely with detective and the task force. She also coordinated with the animal welfare specialists and veterinarians treating the rescued animals. It was emotionally exhausting and occasionally traumatizing work, but Sarah found she couldn't stop. Scout and Hope had become her focus, her personal mission to see justice served. The psychological toll on the rescued animals required specialized care. Beyond the physical injuries and malnutrition, the dogs exhibited severe behavioral issues. Many had to be kept in separate enclosures because they'd become aggressive, a trauma response to years of confinement and abuse. Others were so broken they barely interacted with their caregivers. Hope, Scout's mother, underwent emergency surgery for her fractured ribs. Doctor coordinated with a specialist veterinary surgeon, and the procedure lasted 4 hours. Sarah waited in the clinic's waiting room the entire time, unable to work on case files despite bringing them with her. All she could do was sit, wait, and worry about the dog that had somehow conveyed her desperation to her offspring. The surgery was successful, but Hope's recovery was touch and go for days. Doctor explained that the dog's body was so ravaged by malnutrition that infection was a constant threat. Pneumonia, kidney failure, and sepsis were all possibilities. The veterinary team started Hope on aggressive antibiotic therapy and specialized nutritional support, carefully increasing her food intake as her digestive system adapted to actual nourishment. Scout, meanwhile, recovered with remarkable speed. At 8 weeks old, his body's resilience was remarkable. Within days of arriving at the clinic, the puppy was eating solid food, playing, and beginning to show the personality of a normal puppy. But Scout remained emotionally attached to Sarah, refusing to settle unless she was present. The clinic staff joked that Scout had claimed Sarah as his personal property. "I think he knows what you did for him," Doctor told Sarah one afternoon. "Animals have instincts about people. Scout recognizes you as his savior." The investigation continued in parallel with the rescue and recovery efforts. Federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined they had sufficient grounds to charge with multiple felonies: animal cruelty, animal trafficking, operating an illegal animal breeding facility, money laundering, and conspiracy. The charge list was extensive, reflecting the systematic nature of his crimes. Was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Scout had led Sarah to the warehouse. The arrest was captured by a local news crew that had been following the developing story, and Perp Walk, the businessman in handcuffs being led from his comfortable home, became emblematic of a larger social conversation about animal welfare and exploitation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrest. Sarah received a subpoena requiring her to testify, along with numerous other witnesses, animal control officers, veterinarians, financial investigators, and representatives from the animal welfare agencies. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Sarah continued visiting the clinic daily. She watched Hope gradually regain strength, though the mother dog's transformation was slower and more difficult than Scout's. Hope had been through too much, endured too much suffering. Trust didn't return quickly or easily. But one day, about 3 weeks after the rescue, something changed. Sarah was sitting in Hope's recovery area and the dog slowly approached her. Hope's body language was still cautious, but something in her eyes had shifted. The dog pressed her muzzle against Sarah's chest, and though she didn't wag her tail, that behavior would take longer to return. She remained close, leaning into the officer's embrace. Sarah cried that day. Happy tears, cathartic tears, tears of relief that this broken creature was beginning to heal. The preliminary hearing took place on a cold November morning. Sarah about her patrol that night, about following Scout, about discovering the warehouse operation. She described the conditions in clinical, professional language, but her voice carried the weight of her emotional investment in the case. The prosecutors presented their evidence methodically. The breeding records showing systematic operation, the financial records documenting profit motives, the veterinary reports detailing animal abuse, the photographic evidence of deplorable conditions. They presented testimony from veterinary experts explaining the long-term health consequences of systematic neglect and abuse. The defense attorney argued that his client had simply made unfortunate choices in property management and that the animal welfare issues were exaggerated. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge found sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial and set bail at $50,000, a conservative amount that was able to post within hours. But the legal battle was far from over. The prosecution indicated they were building a comprehensive case that would take months to prepare properly. They were interviewing buyers who'd purchased puppies from the operation, documenting health problems in animals sold to unsuspecting families. They were coordinating with federal authorities to investigate potential money laundering through shell companies. Sarah left the preliminary hearing feeling both vindicated and frustrated. Justice was beginning to move, but it moved slowly through the legal system. Meanwhile, the animals continued their recovery, some progressing, others struggling, all carrying psychological scars that might never fully heal. But as she drove to the veterinary clinic that afternoon to visit Scout and Hope, Sarah realized something important. The legal process was proceeding, the evidence was compelling, and no matter how long justice took, would answer for what he'd done. Scout met her at the clinic entrance with unbridled enthusiasm, his young puppy energy finally fully expressed. Hope followed behind, moving slower but deliberately seeking Sarah's attention. The mother dog's tail wagged hesitantly, a small gesture that represented an enormous journey from despair to hope. Justice, Sarah understood, came in many forms. Some of it would be delivered through courtrooms and legal verdicts, but some of it, perhaps the most important kind, was already being delivered in the form of animals learning to trust again, to heal again, to live again. 6 weeks into recovery at Riverside Emergency Veterinary Hospital, the transformation of the rescued dogs was becoming increasingly visible, though the psychological scars remained deeply embedded. Hope, Scout's mother, represented the most profound journey. Her physical recovery had progressed steadily. Her ribs were mending, her weight was increasing with carefully monitored nutrition, and her coat was beginning to show signs of health returning beneath the regrowth of new fur. But the emotional reconstruction was far more complex. Doctor had explained to Sarah that animals who'd endured prolonged trauma often experienced something similar to human PTSD. They might flinch at sudden movements. They could become anxious during medical procedures, even those designed to help them. Some developed aggressive responses as protection mechanisms, lashing out to prevent future hurt. Others became withdrawn and unresponsive, shutting down emotionally as a survival strategy. Hope had adopted a combination of these responses. She would accept Sarah's presence calmly, but other people made her nervous. She'd flinch when male staff members approached, suggesting her abuse might have been primarily inflicted by men. She refused to be confined in small spaces, even the comfortable recovery enclosures designed for her healing. The veterinary team had to keep her recovery space as open as possible, which complicated medical monitoring. Scout, meanwhile, was thriving with almost startling resilience. At 14 weeks old now, the puppy had completely recovered from his ordeal. He weighed a healthy amount, his coat was glossy and clean, and his personality had emerged as playful, affectionate, and remarkably intelligent. The veterinary staff had noted that Scout seemed to understand cause and effect. He'd learned to ring a bell when he needed to go outside, had mastered basic commands, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded typical puppy development. But Scout's most remarkable trait was his apparent empathy toward his mother. Whenever Sarah visited, Scout would greet her with unbridled enthusiasm, but then he'd immediately approach Hope and something extraordinary would happen. The young puppy would gently nuzzle his mother, as if reassuring her that it was safe, that help was real, that they'd survived. "I've never seen anything quite like it," Doctor had commented one afternoon while watching Scout comfort his mother. "That puppy is emotionally supporting his mother's recovery. It's remarkable." Sarah's visits had become a fixture of the clinic's afternoon routine. She'd arrive after her shift, still in her police uniform, and spend 2 to 3 hours with Scout and Hope. She'd walk the puppy, play with him in the clinic's enclosed recovery yard, and sit quietly with Hope, allowing the traumatized dog to acclimate to her presence at the dog's own pace. The other rescued animals were recovering in different ways. 2 of Hope's offspring, the smaller puppies rescued from her enclosure, now named Lucky and Daisy, had bonded closely with each other. They exhibited typical puppy behavior, though with lingering anxiety. The older German shepherd from the adjacent enclosure, named Shadow, remained more severely damaged. The dog had required additional surgical interventions for injuries sustained during years of breeding without rest, and her prognosis remained guarded. But it was Hope's recovery that consumed Sarah's emotional energy. The breakthrough came on an unseasonably warm afternoon in early December. Sarah had arrived at the clinic straight from her shift, still wearing her uniform. Scout greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, jumping and spinning in circles. But this time, something was different about Hope. The mother dog had been placed in the clinic's outdoor recovery area for physical therapy. Doctor believed gentle exercise would aid both physical and psychological healing. Hope was lying in the grass beneath a large oak tree when Sarah entered the yard. The dog lifted her head at the sound of Sarah's approach, her ears perking up slightly. Sarah had learned to move slowly and deliberately around Hope, never making sudden gestures, always giving the traumatized animal space to initiate contact. She settled onto the grass about 10 feet from where Hope lay, neither approaching nor turning away. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing was simply quiet presence. Scout bounded over immediately, climbing into Sarah's lap and settling against her chest with a contented sigh. The puppy watched his mother, as if silently encouraging her to take the same step. Minutes passed in comfortable silence. Sarah stroked Scout's ears while watching Hope carefully. The mother dog's body language was gradually shifting, her muscles were relaxing, her jaw unclenching. After about 5 minutes, Hope slowly stood and turned toward Sarah, moving with deliberate care. Sarah held her breath, aware that this moment was significant. She'd learned not to push, not to reach out, but to allow Hope to make her own choices about contact and trust. Hope walked slowly across the grass, closing the distance between them. Her movements were still stiff, her healing ribs likely still caused discomfort, but her pace was steady and purposeful. The mother dog approached until she stood directly in front of Sarah, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Sarah saw the dog's eyes shift from wariness to something else entirely. In that gaze, she recognized acknowledgement. Hope was looking at the person who had orchestrated her rescue, who had cared for her through recovery, who represented the turning point from suffering to healing. Hope's tail, which had remained mostly still for 6 weeks, began to move. Not the exuberant wagging of a healthy, happy dog, but a slow, deliberate motion that carried profound significance. The mother dog lowered her head and pressed it against Sarah's chest, mirroring the exact position Scout had taken. Sarah felt something break open inside her. Tears began streaming down her face as she embraced Hope, carefully avoiding the dog's healing ribs but allowing full contact. Hope remained motionless, simply leaning into Sarah's embrace, and in that stillness was an entire narrative of trauma overcome, trust restored, and the possibility of healing. Scout remained in Sarah's lap, and for several minutes, the three of them existed in a moment of profound connection. A woman, a traumatized mother dog, and a brave puppy who'd saved his entire family, united in a bond forged through crisis and suffering, but transformed into something approaching redemption. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered to Hope, though the dog hadn't been responsible for any suffering. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you, but you're safe now. You're going to be okay, I promise you that." Doctor observed the moment from a distance, standing near the clinic's doorway. When she later spoke with Sarah, her eyes were wet. "That's the moment I know an animal is going to fully recover," Doctor said quietly. "When they decide to trust again, Hope has made her decision. She's choosing to believe in recovery." Over the following weeks, Hope's transformation accelerated. The psychological barrier that had confined her began to dissolve. She became more interactive with the veterinary staff, less defensive around new people. She began playing gently with Scout and the other puppies. Her appetite improved. The physical signs of abuse began to fade beneath healthy new coat growth. Scout remained Hope's constant companion and emotional support. The young dog had appointed himself his mother's caretaker, and the bond between them deepened into something remarkable. Veterinary staff documented their interactions for educational purposes. The puppy's instinctive understanding of his mother's emotional state, his gentle encouragement, his refusal to leave her side during medical procedures. Sarah continued her daily visits, now often joined by Detective, who'd become invested in the animal's recovery. The detective brought reports on the ongoing case preparations, updating Sarah on how the prosecution was progressing. But increasingly, visits were less about case business and more about witnessing the animal's healing. "This is why we do this job," said one afternoon, watching Scout and Hope play together in the clinic's yard. "Not for the legal victories or the convictions. It's for moments like this, watching something broken get put back together." By mid-December, Hope had completed her initial recovery phase. Doctor declared the mother dog ready for long-term rehabilitation placement, a specialized facility dedicated to helping severely traumatized animals readjust to normal life. Lucky and Daisy would go to the same facility, and Shadow would remain at the clinic for additional specialized care. The day before Hope, Lucky and Daisy were scheduled to transfer to Haven's Light Rehabilitation Facility. Sarah arrived at the clinic with a decision made. Doctor had been expecting it. "You're going to adopt Scout," the veterinarian said, though it wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "And I'm going to volunteer at Haven's Light. I want to be part of Hope's recovery journey for as long as it takes." Doctor smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that. These animals chose you, Sarah. Scout chose you that night in the parking lot, and Hope chose you in that yard today. Some bonds are meant to be permanent. That evening, Sarah held Scout in her arms while watching Hope sleep peacefully in her recovery enclosure. The mother dog's breathing was steady, her body relaxed, her face peaceful. The traumatized, skeletal creature from the warehouse had transformed into something approaching her natural self. "We're going to get through this," Sarah promised them both. "All of us together." Scout licked her face, his tail wagging with complete certainty that everything was going to be all right. And looking at Hope's peaceful expression, Sarah believed it too. Haven's Light Rehabilitation Facility occupied 12 acres of rolling countryside just outside the city limits. The sprawling property had been donated to the Animal Welfare Organization by a retired veterinarian who dedicated her life to rescuing abused animals. The facility consisted of multiple buildings: a modern veterinary clinic, comfortable recovery kennels, training areas, and open play spaces designed to help traumatized animals acclimate to normal life gradually. Sarah's first day as a volunteer coincided with Hope, Lucky, and Daisy's arrival in mid-December. She'd arranged her police schedule to work 4 10-hour shifts, leaving 3 days each week for volunteer work. Her sergeant had initially objected, but Captain Williams had intervened, recognizing the officer's emotional investment in the case and understanding that her continued involvement might actually enhance the prosecution's case. "Just don't let it interfere with your primary responsibilities," Williams had cautioned, but there was approval in his eyes. The facility's director, Doctor, was a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked directly with animals. She'd been running Haven's Light for 15 years and had successfully rehabilitated hundreds of animals deemed irredeemable by others. "Recovery isn't linear," Doctor explained to Sarah during her volunteer orientation. "These animals will have good days and difficult days. Sometimes progress seems impossible, but with patience, consistency, and unconditional support, most animals can learn to trust again." Hope was placed in one of the facility's specialized recovery enclosures, a comfortable space with outdoor access, designed to prevent the claustrophobia that triggered her anxiety. Lucky and Daisy were given adjacent spaces where they could interact, but also have individual recovery time. The puppies bonded quickly with facility staff, their youth making them more adaptable to new environments. Hope's recovery was more complex. The first week, the mother dog barely ate, spending most of her time lying on bedding, staring at nothing. Doctor explained this was common: the overwhelming newness of the environment, the absence of Sarah's regular presence, and the lingering trauma all contributed to a regression in progress. But Sarah visited 3 times each week, and those visits became Hope's anchor points. The dog would perk up at the sound of Sarah's voice, would eat better when Sarah was present, would engage in gentle play that became progressively more animated with each visit. "She's bonded to you," Doctor observed during one visit. "That's actually beneficial for rehabilitation. You're her primary anchor to trust. We can use that to help her expand her circle of trust to others." Over the following weeks, Sarah began spending her volunteer time working with Hope in structured therapeutic activities. Doctor had trained her in trauma-informed animal rehabilitation techniques, ways of encouraging positive associations, building confidence, and gradually expanding the dog's comfort zone. They'd take Hope for walks on the facility's property, initially with Sarah, but gradually with facility staff members present. They'd play gentle games designed to rebuild the dog's trust in human interaction. They'd practice obedience training, which helped Hope understand that she could influence her environment through communication rather than fear or aggression. Meanwhile, Scout had settled into Sarah's apartment with remarkable ease. The puppy had his own recovery journey to complete. Trauma survivors need time to process their experiences, even young ones. Scout occasionally had anxiety episodes, usually during nighttime hours when darkness triggered memories of warehouse confinement. Sarah would hold him through those episodes, whispering reassurances until he calmed enough to sleep. But the legal system was also moving forward with its own momentum. In late December, 6 weeks after his arrest, detective called Sarah with significant news. "We've found additional properties," reported. "Federal investigators in 3 other states have discovered similar operations connected to. We're talking about a potential 12 illegal breeding facilities across 4 states. The scope is massive. We're potentially looking at over 500 animals rescued in total." The case had evolved into something the FBI was designating as a major organized animal trafficking investigation. Federal prosecutors were coordinating with state prosecutors, and the charges against were being expanded to include federal offenses: interstate animal trafficking, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. But the most significant development came in early January, when the state's Animal Welfare Department announced they were using the evidence from the Havens Light Rescue to draft stronger legislation specifically targeting illegal animal breeding operations. "We're looking at felony-level penalties for operating unlicensed breeding facilities," the state representative explained during a press conference that Sarah watched in the Havens Light break room. "This legislation is being named the Scout and Hope Law in recognition of the animals whose rescue exposed this criminal enterprise." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched footage of Scout and Hope displayed on the news segment, their images now synonymous with animal welfare advocacy. By February, as Hope's recovery progressed and Scout grew into his puppy adolescence, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly involved in animal welfare advocacy. The local news station asked her to do a feature story on animal rescue and rehabilitation. She agreed, with the stipulation that the focus be on Havens Light's work and animal welfare legislation rather than on her personally. During the interview, conducted at the facility with Hope and Scout present, Sarah spoke passionately about the systemic nature of animal cruelty and the importance of legislative protection. "These animals didn't choose to be abused," Sarah said, her hand resting gently on Hope's head. "They were victims of a deliberate, systematic operation designed to exploit them for profit. We need stronger laws, better enforcement, and a cultural shift in how we value animal welfare. Every animal deserves the chance to live without fear or suffering." The feature aired on a Sunday evening and generated significant community response. Animal welfare organizations invited Sarah to speak at community events. The local university asked her to participate in a panel discussion about animal cruelty and criminal justice. She began receiving emails from people who'd purchased puppies from pet shops that received their animals from operation, wanting to share their animals' health problems and express gratitude that the operation had been exposed. Doctor approached Sarah one afternoon in March with an unusual proposition. "I'd like to offer you a position," Doctor said as they watched Hope play with Lucky and Daisy in the facility's outdoor area. "Not just as a volunteer, but as a part-time staff member. We could use someone with your police background and your commitment to animal welfare. You could help us develop partnerships with law enforcement, advocate for stronger legislation, and train other officers in recognizing animal cruelty." Sarah's immediate response was yes, but she had to consult with her police department leadership first. Captain Williams was surprisingly supportive. "Take the position," he encouraged. "We could use an officer with expertise in animal welfare, and frankly, having police involvement in animal advocacy helps our department's community relations." By April, Sarah had officially transitioned into a hybrid role. A full-time police officer working primarily on animal welfare crimes and cruelty investigations, combined with a part-time position at Havens Light coordinating between law enforcement and animal rehabilitation services. The adjustment was profound. Sarah found herself working cases she'd never previously encountered, animal hoarding situations, neglect investigations, and most importantly, illegal breeding operations. Several of her new cases directly connected to this operation. Pet shops that had received animals from his facilities were being investigated for fraudulent business practices. Buyers who'd purchased sick puppies were taking legal action against the shops. It became apparent that exposing one operation had opened the door to investigating an entire underground economy of animal exploitation. Federal authorities coordinated multi-state raids on suspected illegal breeding facilities. State agricultural departments implemented new inspection protocols. Universities began researching the psychological impacts of trauma on animals rescued from abuse situations. Hope's recovery became something of a flagship case for Haven's Light. The facility used her journey in educational materials and fundraising campaigns. Volunteers who worked with Hope learned valuable techniques for rehabilitating severely traumatized animals. By April, Hope had progressed to the point where she was allowed supervised interactions with potential adoptive families, not for adoption yet, as her recovery was ongoing, but to help her build confidence in new social situations. Scout, now 7 months old, had grown into a strikingly beautiful young dog. His German Shepherd heritage was evident in his athletic build and intelligent eyes. But what set Scout apart was his temperament. He carried an emotional maturity unusual in a puppy, as if his early trauma and subsequent recovery had imprinted wisdom beyond his years. Sarah had begun training Scout as an assistance dog, specifically for work with traumatized animals. The young dog had demonstrated remarkable empathy and the ability to calm anxious animals through his own presence. Doctor believed Scout could eventually become a therapy animal, helping other abuse survivors through their recovery processes. That puppy saved his own family and then exposed a massive criminal operation, Doctor mused one afternoon. He's already done more good than most animals do in a lifetime, but I think his real calling is helping others heal. As spring turned toward summer, Sarah reflected on how radically her life had changed. 12 months earlier, she'd been a routine patrol officer conducting standard traffic stops and responding to typical calls. Now, she was working animal cruelty cases that had international implications, speaking at universities and legislative committees, and helping to reshape how society viewed animal welfare. It all traced back to one desperate puppy appearing in a parking lot, choosing to trust a uniformed stranger, and leading her toward a rescue that rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Haven's Light was preparing to celebrate its anniversary with a gala fundraiser, and Doctor had invited Sarah to bring Scout and Hope for a special presentation about the animal's recovery journey. Standing in the facility's office, looking at photographs of Hope's transformation and Scout's growth, Sarah understood that this was truly a new beginning, not just for the animals, but for herself as well. By late summer, 8 months after that fateful night in the parking lot, Scout had completed his formal rehabilitation and was declared ready for permanent placement. At 14 months old, the young German Shepherd was a strikingly beautiful dog, lean and athletic, with intelligent eyes that seemed to comprehend far more than typical canine understanding. The veterinary team at Haven's Light documented his remarkable recovery in their clinical files, but the more important recovery was emotional and psychological. Doctor, who'd followed Scout's progress throughout his rehabilitation, provided her final assessment during a consultation with Sarah and Doctor. "This dog has transcended his trauma," Doctor explained, reviewing Scout's medical charts. "Physically, he's completely healthy. Psychologically, he's adjusted better than most animals who experienced similar abuse. What's remarkable is his apparent emotional intelligence. He understands cause and effect. He demonstrates empathy toward other traumatized animals, and he maintains an unusual level of composure under stress." The question of Scout's future had been circulating through Haven's Light for weeks. Multiple adoption applications had arrived, people who'd followed the news coverage and wanted to adopt the hero puppy. There were offers from celebrities, wealthy philanthropists, and families willing to provide ideal homes. But Doctor had held firm on one principle. Scout would go to someone who understood his history, who could provide continuity of care, and who had already proven themselves trustworthy. Sarah had known for months that she wanted to officially adopt Scout, but she'd waited, understanding that the decision should be Scout's choice as much as hers. The puppy had other options. He deserved to know he was being chosen specifically, not by default. On a warm August afternoon, Sarah arrived at Havens Light with adoption paperwork already completed. Scout seemed to sense something was different about that day. The young dog followed her from the moment she arrived, staying close to her side as she greeted staff members and other animals. "You're ready?" Doctor asked, handing Sarah the formal adoption agreement. "We're ready," Sarah confirmed, looking down at Scout, who gazed up at her with complete certainty. "Aren't we, buddy?" Scout's response was immediate, a tail wag that expressed absolute affirmation. The paperwork was ceremonial at that point. Scout had never truly been Havens Light's dog. He'd been waiting for his person. The adoption simply formalized what had been inevitable since that night in the parking lot. Hope's journey followed a different path, but one equally significant. By August, the mother dog had progressed to the point where Doctor believed she was ready for adoption into a carefully selected home. Hope remained somewhat anxious around strangers, but she'd learned to trust, to play, and to experience joy. Her physical recovery was complete. Her ribs had healed, her coat had grown back healthy and glossy, and her weight was now ideal. But finding the right family for Hope required careful consideration. This wasn't a dog who could go to just any home. She needed people who understood her history, who could be patient with her occasional anxiety, and who would commit to ongoing behavioral support. The application that stood out came from a retired teacher and her husband, both in their late 60s. They'd spent their lives working with children who'd experienced trauma, and they'd recently decided to apply their skills to animal rehabilitation. They had experience with German Shepherds, a quiet home environment, and most importantly, they understood the concept of unconditional patience. When the family visited Havens Light to meet Hope, something remarkable happened. The mother dog approached them cautiously, as she always did with new people, but after a few minutes, she settled beside the retired teacher, resting her head on the woman's lap. It was as if Hope had somehow recognized kindred spirits, people who understood suffering and recovery. Sarah facilitated the introduction, and she found herself crying as she watched Hope begin to bond with her potential new family. The dog was choosing them, just as Scout had chosen Sarah. "She's going to have a wonderful life," the retired teacher said, stroking Hope's ears. "We're going to give her everything she deserves." Within 2 weeks, both adoptions were finalized. Scout moved permanently into Sarah's apartment, which she'd upgraded to a house with a large backyard specifically to accommodate his needs. Hope went to her new family in a quiet suburban neighborhood where she'd spend her days playing in a spacious yard and her nights sleeping on a comfortable bed. But the story didn't end with adoption. In September, trial began. The courtroom was filled with media representatives, animal welfare advocates, and curious citizens. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. Financial experts about the operation's profitability. Veterinarians described the physical and psychological impacts of systematic abuse. Detectives presented evidence of interstate trafficking and organized operation structure. Sarah for 3 hours, describing that night in meticulous detail. She spoke about Scout's desperate behavior, the discovery of the warehouse, and the conditions of the animals. The prosecution had asked her if she'd be willing to bring Scout to court as a visual representation of the case. Scout entered the courtroom wearing a special vest identifying him as an assistance animal. The young dog sat beside Sarah throughout her testimony, his calm presence somehow emphasizing the gravity of what she was describing. Several jurors openly wept as they looked at the healthy, thriving dog and contemplated what he'd endured. The defense presented a weak argument, claiming had simply made poor business decisions and that the animal welfare violations were exaggerated. But the evidence was overwhelming. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Was convicted of animal cruelty, animal trafficking, operating an illegal animal breeding facility, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $425,000 in restitution to animal welfare organizations and veterinary clinics that had provided emergency care to his victims. More significantly, the trial generated national media attention. News outlets covered not just the conviction, but the animals' recovery stories. Scout and Hope became symbols of animal welfare advocacy. Their journey from abuse to recovery inspired similar investigations across the country. Federal authorities dismantled 4 additional illegal breeding operations connected to this network, resulting in the rescue of over 300 additional dogs. The state legislature passed the Scout and Hope Animal Protection Act in November, legislation that established felony-level penalties for operating illegal breeding facilities, required mandatory veterinary inspections of all animal breeding operations, and created specialized law enforcement units dedicated to animal cruelty investigations. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, signed into law by the governor in a ceremony attended by Sarah, Scout, and representatives from Havens Light. Sarah's career trajectory shifted fundamentally. She was promoted to detective specializing in animal cruelty investigations, a position that had previously been only part-time. She coordinated with federal authorities on interstate animal trafficking cases. She trained other officers in recognizing signs of animal abuse. She worked with prosecutors on complex animal cruelty cases. Scout became an official police department assistant, working alongside Sarah on investigations and community outreach. The young dog's presence at press conferences and community events helped humanize animal welfare issues. Children who might have been indifferent to animal cruelty became passionate advocates after meeting Scout and hearing his story. Havens Light experienced a surge in donations and volunteer support. The facility expanded to a second location, allowing them to rescue and rehabilitate even more animals. Doctor established a training program specifically focused on trauma recovery in abused animals, using Scout and Hope's cases as foundational educational material. By their first anniversary of rescue, Scout had grown into a strikingly mature young dog. At 20 months old, he carried himself with an unusual gravity, as if aware of the significance of his journey. Sarah had trained him in advanced obedience and scent detection, and he accompanied her on investigations, helping to identify other illegal breeding operations through his remarkable ability to recognize the specific scents associated with systematic confinement and abuse. Hope thrived in her suburban home, becoming something of a neighborhood ambassador. Her adoptive family brought her to local schools to teach children about animal welfare and the realities of abuse. The mother dog, once skeletal and traumatized, had become a living testament to the power of recovery and resilience. One evening in October, on the anniversary of that fateful night, Sarah sat in her house with Scout resting his head on her lap. She reflected on how radically her life had changed. The routine patrol officer who'd been cruising quiet streets had become a detective advocating for animals at the legislative level. The woman who'd once counted down hours until her shift ended now found profound purpose in her work. "You changed everything," she whispered to Scout, stroking his ears. "You and Hope, you both changed everything." Scout's tail thumped gently against the floor, his eyes closed in contentment. This dog, who'd been born into suffering, had survived desperation, had become a symbol of hope, quite literally. He taught Sarah that courage came in all sizes, that one individual's choice to trust could create ripples of change extending far beyond what anyone could predict. The case files remained in the police department's archives, documentation of a criminal enterprise that had victimized hundreds of animals. But the real legacy existed in the animals rescued and rehabilitated, the laws strengthened, the awareness raised, and the lives changed. Scout fell asleep in Sarah's lap, his breathing steady and peaceful. Outside, the October night was clear and calm. Somewhere across the city, Hope slept in her comfortable home, her mother watching over her with the devotion of a woman who understood what it meant to be rescued. And in police departments and animal welfare organizations across the country, other officers and advocates were recognizing signs of animal trafficking, using the protocols developed from this case, saving animals that might otherwise have suffered. One brave puppy had sought help in a parking lot. That choice had created a chain reaction of justice, healing, and transformation that would echo through years and generations to come. And it all began because a desperate, malnourished animal understood, at a level beyond conscious thought, that a uniformed officer represented hope. Scout and Hope's story became legendary in animal welfare circles, a testament to the power of individual animals to expose systematic cruelty and inspire systemic change. But for Sarah, the real meaning was simpler and more profound. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a small, desperate creature choosing to trust. And if we're wise enough to follow, we might find ourselves part of something far greater than we could ever have imagined. The end.